So I'm going to introduce you to some work that I've been doing with Eric Brynjolfsson, Christy Coe, and Mark Duggan, looking at the past, present, and future of work in California, broadly construed, but also specifically focused on economic mobility and inequality. And so before I do that, I want to prompt you to think about two questions as I talk today. So for the next 10 minutes, keep this kind of running in the back of your mind. Where in California is AI being developed, and who is it that's doing the developing? These questions might not make much sense right now, but I hope they will by the end of the presentation. So this work started with a call from the California 100 organization, who convened research teams across California to investigate different topics of economic and social life in California, with the goal of understanding the past, but also envisioning what might happen in the next 100 years or so. It's a long-term goal, I know, but the teams put together really robust reports for this. And so our topic was economic mobility, workforce, and inequality. And when Christy first approached me with this, I was like, what the hell are we going to do with this? It's such a broad kind of topic for us to cover. So what we decided to do was ground our report in the idea of polarization. So polarization is something that you're probably all familiar with. But the basic idea is that at least for the last, 50 years or so, wages for the top 10% of earners have been going up relative to the bottom earners and the mid-level earners. And so they've even seen a slight decrease in their wages relative to the past. And so before I keep going with this, I want to just acknowledge that most of this polarization that we see can probably be explained by racism, and especially racism that has influenced educational disparities in California. And so I want to make sure to point out that we're not discounting that, but we're not experts in that topic. And so we instead decided to look at the geographic distribution of jobs in California and how that influences polarization. And so what we did was we first started looking at what each county's weekly average wage was. And so as you probably expected, the Bay Area has relatively high wages compared to the inland counties and the northern counties in California. And so we did some digging and we found that that couldn't totally be accounted for by differences in cost of living. So what really was it? And so we started to look at each region independently, and we wanted to really probe for what kind of drove polarization across the state, and if differences across the regions had any impact on that. And what that led us to is to put together these local histories of regional economies. And so we broke it down based on California 100's recommendations into 9 different regions. I won't go through each of them. I'll just give a cool example, which is San Diego, which in modern times, their economy was built around the military, specifically the Navy. So they had a deep water port that was really beneficial to Navy and military jobs. And Department of Defense jobs tend to be pretty, equal. So there's a salary scale, and you're not going to get a lot of polarization from there. But as eras of war and peace kind of kept changing, the economy diversified, and you got a lot of tourism, so more tourism through that deep water port. And then research that was funded by the Department of Defense, communications and scientific research, gave rise to companies like Qualcomm and the biotech startups that we see today. And so that kind of widening of the gap really led to some polarization in San Diego. And so if you're interested, I can talk more about different regions. I will talk about one more later in the talk. So after we put together these regional histories, we really wanted to wrap our hands around what was happening today. So not history, what's happening actually in the present day. And so what we did was start to put together some data, just looking across different regions. And so a team of postdocs and graduate students from Estel started to collect some data, quantitative data, beginning with descriptive data. And so you can see in this example from the dashboard, we first give a little example of the regional history, and then we go into some descriptive stats about the economy there. So what's the population, what's the average wage, the average income, unemployment rate, things like that. But part of what California 100 challenged us to do was get a little more predictive. And so what we decided to do was focus on featured occupations. So we selected 3 occupations from each region. So you can see for San Diego, that's a fast food worker, a biotech worker, and a telecom worker. We chose these based on what was overrepresented in that region relative to the rest of California. So, there's more biotech workers in the San Diego region than you would expect to find in the rest of California. And then we also picked one that we expected to change, or that was central to the region's history. And so after doing that, we decided to focus more in depth on each of these occupations. So this example of registered nurse gives you a good idea of what we did there. We had a top-notch designer, Sean Eric Hashi, who is here today, who helped us put together this dashboard, who did all the heavy lifting for this. And what we did was begin to look at what the future of these jobs might look like. And so this prototype for San Diego and the registered nurse here shows you what we're getting at. So we wanted to look at projected job openings, things like Eric's work on the suitability for machine learning, so how these occupations might change in the future. In addition to things like the potential for doing some of these jobs remotely. And so we then decided to interview some of these workers to get their kind of perceptions of how they felt about their job. We asked them about their career trajectory. We asked them about changes in technology. We asked them about changes in working arrangements, so how employers have changed. And we also asked them about how they feel about the future of their job. So some of the trends we uncovered across all of these different streams of research are up on this slide here. I'm going to focus today, because most of us are interested in technology, on the technology trend. And specifically, I'm going to focus on this last one, so automating blue-collar work with AI-enabled robots. I choose that one because I'm also primarily working with Matt Bean on his project, looking at the implications of the implementation of AI-enabled robots in warehouses. And so from that work, I kind of got the sense that what I wanted to focus on, the reason I wanted to focus on this work is that there were clear links to the regional histories where warehouses are growing. And so as manufacturing jobs and other type of blue-collar jobs declined across California, and specifically in the Inland Empire and the San Joaquin Valley now, warehousing firms seized on the opportunity to grab relatively cheap land. It's still California, so it's still pretty expensive, but relatively cheap land. It's close to ports. It's close to ports and close to major shipping routes. And so as those warehouses started to grow and we started to see more and more warehouses pop up across California, we also saw venture-backed startups developing AI-enabled robots to kind of take over some of the work in these warehouses. And so through that work, we found that we wanted to kind of understand what those implementations mean for low-wage workers. And so I want to point out that it's not just that these jobs are low wage, it's also that warehouse jobs have been actively de-skilled for decades. And so a lot of our research participants say that when they're looking for warehouse workers, they're looking for warm bodies that can kind of just do these routine manual tasks that take very little training. The training for a warehouse job takes a matter of hours, and people are often running to do warehouse work. And so at the same time, warehouses are purchasing and piloting these AI-enabled robots, and we found that these implementations rarely go smoothly. And so vendors take a lot of time and effort to implement these robots, make them work, integrate them into their operations. And so that process takes a lot of adaptation and rework. And so the major point I want to make here that I kind of stumbled through all this to try to get to is that warehouse workers are central to making these new technologies, these AI-enabled technologies, fit with normal operations. What does that look like? So they suggest changes to the user interface to be more amenable to different languages and different education levels. They artfully kind of manage the interoperability with other aspects of warehouse technologies. And they surface problems to these robot vendors that otherwise would have gone unnoticed and taken much more effort to kind of work around. And so these venture-backed startups who develop these AI-enabled technologies, they take what they learned from these warehouses and these warehouse workers, they implement it into their next version of the technology, and then they sell it to someone else. And so there are, I don't mean to kind of put these vendors in a negative light, but what I mean to say here is that I want to return to this question of where in California AI is being developed and who's developing AI. And so what I hope to have shown, and I'm sorry that I stumbled through some of it because it's really important to me, is that it's not just startups in the Bay Area who are developing AI. It's not just the typical people, I think someone referred to them as tech bros earlier, who are really doing all of the work to develop this AI. In fact, there's other types of workers who, not just in warehouses, who help to develop these technologies. And so I'm very prone to point out the historical examples of things when we're confronted with something that's supposed to be revolutionary and new and different. But history has many examples of these unsung heroes who drive technological development. We can think here about switchboard operators for early telephone systems, or we can think here about, contemporarily, we can think about open source software developers who voluntarily put a lot of work into developing new software, and then it's used by very many different people. But what history also tells us is that there are very few examples of those unsung heroes being rewarded or even recognized for their contributions to their development. And so I want to take time to just think about how we might do that. How might we recognize and reward these people who are so central to developing new technologies and the AI that we've been talking about today? These workers do not have the kind of access to time and resources that we would expect AI developers, as we traditionally think about them, to have. And so it's time to really start to think about what we can do to recognize them and kind of take that as a call to action to try to think about how we can make their contributions rewarded. And so I want to prompt you now to think about who the other unsung heroes of AI development might be. Who are you thinking about that, other than warehouse workers, that are really central to what we're talking about here today? So one example might be farm workers on the Central Coast who are helping develop agricultural technologies that pick crops at a higher yield or at a more efficient yield. Or the remote call center workers who develop customer service AI based on their chat logs and everything else, and when they step in to handle difficult cases and all these different things that vendors of AI learn from. I think we even had some examples of that today. And so I'll just close by asking you to think about how we can reward these contributions and how we might want to do this. And I'll suggest that the first step should be to just simply ask these workers how they want to be included and how they'd like to be rewarded. Because this is not a charity case that we're talking about. These workers are not charity cases. They are hardworking people who have a lot to offer, and I would argue have as much of a role in developing AI as the top computer scientists and roboticists and engineers. And so I'll close by saying, and I know I'm over time, who should be responsible for ensuring this equity for workers in AI's progress? Should it be the AI vendors? Should it be the organizations who buy the AI? Should it be the government? In reality, it's probably a combination of all those things, all those people, all those parties. But it's incumbent upon us and everyone in this room to start to think about that as a way to move forward here. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'll close by I want to acknowledge this was a big group effort. A lot of people contributed to this, and I want to take time to thank them. Thank you.
All right, we've got time for a few questions. I can start. I know that this work has been focused on California, but if you were to think about expanding it to other regions, other states, what would that look like? What would some of the things you've talked about, what would you look for? It would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, so I think we'd have to start to look at how industries have changed in those regions as well. So I'd like to start with history, and so I think we had an example earlier today of a textile town and how that change in that economy kind of drove changes that ended in a pretty bad situation. And so I think we'd have to start with the history of kind of what the region is and kind of take a similar tack. But also think about what the particularities of that region are. So California is known for a lot of different industries, agriculture, now warehousing, but technology development. So you'd have to really think about also what those regions are experts in and also what's changed over time.
Great.
Oh, wait, we've got one more question.
Actually, you got two.
Two more.
Thanks for doing this work and thinking about this. I do think we need to be thinking creatively about what's the next structure for how we share surplus in the economy, and humans have been doing that since there were humans, so I think it's important to be thinking about it in that way. And I'm wondering if you've been thinking about, what kinds of things you've been thinking about. Are we thinking about ways to, so we reward people for tiny contributions on capital, right? If you buy a tiny share of it, you're still going to get a percentage on that. Right. Should we be thinking about that with the contributors of the data, the input, the feedback, and so on? Is that nothing? But you're also gesturing towards kind of dignitary recognition. So I'm curious what kinds of things you're thinking about. Would it also be like recognizing these contributions? Somebody can look up their name and say, I'm also an owner, in a sense, of this technology. Right.
So I've thought about this a few different ways. One of them is just, when you work at a startup, you get equity in that company, right? And that's one of the ways that they attract the top talent. That's one of the ways that they keep people around. And so that's one way of thinking about it. What are your contributions? Making a more detailed effort to kind of categorize and document what the individual contributions are and what that is relative to what people at the vendor itself actually does. I think the other way to think about it is just productivity gains at the organization that it's being implemented in, and how, I don't know that there's a way to really study what the difference would be if there were not skilled workers who were making these things fit with normal operations versus, someone being there to kind of make them, that knows the process and is able to help integrate that in. And so that's another way of thinking about it. But I think that you're right about the kind of dignity part of it. And again, I just want to emphasize that, not thinking about this as we need to give them UBI or we need to upskill them. They already have nascent skills that, that is very clear when you go into these warehouses and you observe and you do, any kind of low wage work. I mean, a lot of people in this room couldn't do the kind of work that a lot of low wage, low skill workers do. And so I think that's a pretty important thing to think about, is kind of not framing it as something that is just, we talked a lot about augmenting people with AI today, but we need to think about the inverse of that as well, which is the people are augmenting the AI already. And so rewarding them for contributions that they're already making rather than focusing on what the AI can provide to them.
Great, thanks.
Hi, my question is that I think that since we're in the midst of Silicon Valley and in the tech industry, a lot of the discussion that we have around AI innovation tends to be focused to products that are most familiar to us. So it might be like, how do we make autonomous vehicles more effective in urban environments? Or how do we automate programming for engineers, rather than like, how do we automate the English learning process for a farm worker, or the tools that are available for farm workers to make their physical work less physically destructive for their bodies, that type of thing. So I'm curious as to, in your research, what are some of the industries or regions in California that you found to be most underserved or overlooked by AI advancements and developments?
Yeah, I think one of them is definitely the Central Coast. So think about Salinas here, who that area, it was central to labor organizing in the history of the country. I mean, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, who were central to that. I think that's one region where it's a microcosm of the bigger picture. And so looking there next might be a place to look for kind of how, what kind of differences we might see between what I presented here today and what happens there. Might lend some insight into how we might transfer this to other regions. The other region I'm thinking about a lot these days is the northern part of the state, which is sometimes referred to as the state of Jefferson, because they want to secede from California because they feel so left behind by kind of the environmental protections that we've put in place for good reason, but that killed the logging industry, that killed the timber industry. And they've kind of been left behind in this whole discussion about AI and the transformation of work, because the only economy there really now is tourism. And so how do we think about AI in tourism? I don't know. And so I think it's just as important to think about those cases as much as it is important to think about the cases where AI is on the doorstep of the occupation or the economy that we're talking about.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan.